Okay, we are now to question 5 out of 6. And the question is, how can the process be kept politically non-partisan and free from political capture? Really important question. So we'll put it to all the panelists, starting with Professor Frankel, then Professor Saunders, Emele Dutuituranga, Mr. Lal, and then we're going to give it to our final speaker, Anna Rokomokoti. Professor Frankel, over to you.
Thank you. Well, I don't think it can be kept politically non-partisan and free from political capture. Constitution making, constitution building is an inherently political exercise, and it's important that the parties are represented. And everyone in the panel has emphasised the importance of inclusiveness. And I think Cheryl Saunders said it has to avoid being just a lawyer's exercise. That's right. But also, I think with the constitutional review process, you can, inclusiveness sounds wonderful, but you can go to an extreme of sort of sending out a review team to rural areas and expecting people to tell you what should go in a constitution. You're not going to get an effective dialogue. Something like that happened in Tonga 10 or 15 years ago, where the review team went out with very little kind of clear agenda. I think you do need at the start to establish what the parameters are. You need to identify critical issues, differences that need to be bridged, and try and build some consensus, for example, in terms of reference about what the potential reform agenda is, what's a new constitution trying to achieve, how you can best, in the Fiji context, how you can best establish or promote a unified national identity and avoid the cycle of coups. But the other thing to think about, I mean, not everything needs to be constitutionalized. The electoral law, for example, has been constitutionalized repeatedly in Fiji. Maybe that's a good idea. It certainly hasn't prevented major overhauls time and time again. But the last constitution, before the 2013 one, the Reeves constitution, tried to use the electoral system to generate a kind of multi-ethnic politics very unsuccessfully, if you remember. The electoral system was hoped would encourage moderates and penalize extremists. Clearly didn't work in that way. There was also an attempt at power sharing, a constitutional provision to require power sharing in cabinet, a little similar to the South African transitional constitution in 1994, and maybe with some resemblance also to what happened in Northern Ireland. Now, I don't think that that's likely to be the core focus of the next constitution in Fiji. Why not? Well, if you look at the submissions that came from those parties that have historically appealed to the Fiji Indian community, the Labour Party that used to be the majority Fiji Indian party, and the National Federation Party, which has become more of a multi-ethnic party, but nevertheless has a significant Fiji Indian base, there's no longer that clear call from the minority community for power sharing in cabinet. The demographics have changed. But I still think that a critical issue for people thinking about a new constitution in Fiji is going to be the minority inclusion. It's going to be allowing the Fiji Indian community, that's probably down to around 30% of the population, some kind of voice. So some kind of commitment to proportional representation would seem to be an important element in the constitution. We've been talking a lot about process today, and just before this session, Nilesh mentioned that that was the core intention of today's dialogue. But as things move ahead, I would hope that there would be some focus also on the content of a forthcoming constitution.
Okay, I think the question had to do with political non-partisan. When I became the General Secretary of the one of the political parties some times back ago, I realized the difference between party politics and being political. And I think what we're talking about here is that, as my friend John had said, constitutionality is political, but it can't be captured by parties, yeah? So I think that's the issue, and I guess that's the distinction between those in Parliament and those who are not there. I mean, we have a voting system which is very much, clientele politics. I'll do this, I'll pay your school fees and all of that. And that's the Pacific, so that's difficult. And then, of course, we have interest groups. So when we're saying political capture, they're the business people, they're the drug cartels, they're the military. I'm just saying it as it is, right? So it's not just about political parties. There are those who capture decision making. So I think we have to make sure, and I think the closest I came to it is making sure that the commission itself are people who are reputable. And so when they front up, people can trust that they're not wearing a party badge, that they're not owning some big, we won't mention them, But and it's not to say that they can't influence, but when we're talking about a constitution, that everyone can have some ownership in it, then as much as possible, there has to be a political will, and I'm looking at the Minister of Justice, that's intentionally non-partisan.
Okay, can I begin by making an observation that John made about inclusiveness and how it's possible for it to be overdone. And it actually is. There's been a lot of experimentation with inclusiveness in constitution making around the world over the last 10, 20, 30 years. And I think the consensus has come down in favour of saying, yes, inclusion is very important, but so is leadership. And somehow, in a way that fits the context, you need to put those two things together. And for an example of what can go wrong if you don't have adequate leadership, but you do have a lot of inclusion. Look at Chile and the two failed referendums there in 2022 and 2023. Now, of course, it's true that a constitution amendment process is political, and it is inevitably the parties are going to have positions. But I think what you need to do is to try to prevent it being just politics as usual, where the parties just scrabble and try and get some sort of short-term political advantage. That's not what making a constitution is all about. I think, and there's quite a lot of people giving thought to this in the world at the moment. There's a bit of a chat going on about the advantages of what's called referendum culture. How do you get your culture right so that a referendum process is successful? And so, in my view, the political class, the leaders of the various parties, need to be prepared to accept responsibility, to rise above politics as usual, to play an appropriate leadership role, to accept that they are in a position of privilege in leading a party at this time in Fiji's history, where they have a chance to do something very good in the public interest. And hopefully, if you can get that sort of attitude inculcated, not into the political class, but in those to whom they are responsible, namely the voters, that will help develop a bedrock of some sort of agreement that crosses ordinary political boundaries. The South Africans used to talk in terms of it being important to get sufficient consensus. What is sufficient consensus in anybody's country? And that ought to be the aim in the parliament, if possible. So that means that in order to avoid over-politicisation, it's important that whoever puts the reform process forward doesn't claim political credit for it. That it's important that there's not seen to be any advantage in being a spoiler just for the sake of being a spoiler. And of course, we can't expect politicians to be angels, so they may not do that automatically. But that then it becomes incumbent on civil society, on the media, on all sorts of groups to say that's our expectation. This is a big moment in Fiji's history, and it needs to be handled properly. Now, this maybe does come down also to the composition of the review body, and there are some important thoughts to be thought about the basis upon which that body is constituted. If you have a representative for this group and a representative for that group, the chances are that they'll act in a partisan manner. I mean, who are the people who would engender trust in the Fijian society who could be in that sort of position in this situation? That's just one last thought about it. Sometimes in other referendum contexts, an independent body of some kind has been appointed to oversee the referendum process, not just the voting process, but the process of preparing information for the voters. I think New Zealand did that very effectively, John, when it was doing its electoral changes many decades ago now. And so that's another technique that you could think about in the Fijian situation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Professor Saunders. That was very insightful, including the example from South Africa. Nilesh Lal, you were next.
Well, I think everything is more susceptible to political capture in Fiji due to two reasons. The first one, of course, is that we have a very unaccountable political culture. And then the second reason is the fact that the 2013 Constitution accords too much power in the executive arm of the state. So essentially, this empowers the executive to sort of subdue all other institutions in the state apparatus. And then, of course, coupled with the culture of unaccountability, this has been a particularly problematic mix for Fiji. Now, in such a situation, while it is very, very difficult to come up with a foolproof safeguard, one of the things that can potentially be effective is drawing up a very strong legislation that is going to be spelling out in detail what the review process is going to look like, how the entity that is going to be conducting the constitution review process, which might be called the Constitution Review Committee, how is it going to be constituted, and then what are the powers and resources that the committee has, and then there has to be a very clear process that has to be stipulated in that act. So I think that can possibly become a safeguard, although as I've mentioned, it cannot be 100% safeguard. There are other principles that will need to be very stringently observed in the process, one of which is the need to have transparency. The High Commission set a very good example in this regard in how they publicized all of the submissions. So they received more than 7,000 submissions within a space of 3 months. And every single of these submissions were published on a website that was managed by the commission itself. Right? Now we've had a very significant commission also undertake consultations this year, and that was the Electoral Law Reform Commission. And we have the chair of the commission, Justice Patiaki, that is also in the room here. Right? And despite the good Justice Patiaki's efforts, there was one very little participation. There were consultation rooms that were virtually empty. But one of the things that I was hoping that the commission would be doing was that they were going to be publishing all the submissions that were received, whether these were oral, written submissions, but that has not happened. So when the commission then says, okay, a vast majority of people wanted a constituency-based system, there's nothing at all there for an ordinary Fijian to go and verify whether this was actually true. Right? So if there was a central depository, then we could verify that claim. So that is why it is very important to have mechanisms like that, and to make the whole process very transparent so that everyone can see what the submissions that are being made actually say. And apart from that, I think the idea of a constituent assembly, now this goes beyond what is prescribed by the Constitution. But if you look at the Ghai draft, the idea of a constituent assembly, and I think it was also very well spelled out how that constituent assembly was going to be constituted. Right? So such a body could be instituted by the Constitution Review Act, and it can actually pass it can consider, it can deliberate on the submission that is made by the Constitution Review Commission before it passes on to the parliamentary committee to work on. So these are some of the practical safeguards that can be put in place to prevent political capture of the Constitution review process.
Okay, thank you, Nilesh, for that contribution. I think you have just underscored again that, Constitution amendment is a really serious process. It needs a lot of thought and work. It should not be rushed. Otherwise, we might end up with another short-lived constitution. And we'll live up to our reputation. Okay, now we've got the final question. The question is, what legal and procedural safeguards are needed to align Fiji's review process with international democratic norms and ensure that both the process and the referendum produce fair, informed, and credible outcomes? I'm going to put this question first to Ms. Rocco Mokoti and then to Professor Saunders.
You're very good at what you do, Dr. Shalen. Thank you. Legal safeguards. I think I've emphasized this in one of my answers to one of the previous questions. The mandate of the people is critical. The fact that Fiji has always experienced the lack of public participation in constitution making certainly makes it critical that this time around we get it right and we get the people involved and let the people give the governing bodies the authority to initiate such a important process. Therefore, the people must say yes to the constitutional amendment process, first and foremost, which is why what Mr. Lal mentioned at his during your opening, the need for us to make sure that the people are involved prior to the formulation of this planned bill that was meant to see that was meant to introduced into Parliament recently. Having said that, when we talk about legal safeguards, we have to make sure that we have the necessary legislative framework in place. Example, we don't have a referendum act. So this is just one piece of legislation that needs to be in place prior to this whole process taking off. Also, there's a need to comply with the constitutional provisions. I'm of the view that the 3/4 apply. That is my humble opinion. I have reasons to subscribe to that position. I'm of the view that the double 3/4 apply. It's high, and it's been said to be impossible. In this regard, I'd like to say the Fijian human spirit has never been tested as such before. The threshold is so high that there is a persistent push of the idea that it's almost impossible. It's not impossible, it's almost impossible. So I think it's doable in the sense that we all say that the game of politics and changing laws is about numbers, but if we really truly believe that the people of this country want to have a say and want to change this constitution, give it back to them. And if indeed that is true, you will see it. So again, I go back to my original point. You must have the mandate of the people. And how do you secure that? You have to go to them. You have to go to us and ask in the first place. It's a very basic step, it's a very small step, but it's a very significant step in the right direction. Because if we are to say that we can circumvent that express legal provision, it's express, it's not implied, it's expressed. Surely it must mean the literal 3/4. That's my humble view. Having said that, Parliament needs to have 3/4. You need to have 3/4 of the voters. I know in India there is provisions for the Supreme Court of India to give advisory opinion, but those opinions are not binding, they are persuasive, and I'd like to apply the same principle here. So having said all that, legal compliance is important. And just the last bit, in terms of procedures, procedural safeguards, the rules must be clear right from day one. Impartiality, inclusivity, experts inclusion, extensive public participation and consultation, nationwide consultation, civic education, transparency at every turn, at every corner, at every ascent, at every descent. The people must know what's happening in the whole process, like Mr. Lal had emphasized much earlier. So those are just some of my thoughts on that question.
Okay, excellent remarks. Thank you, especially about the legal requirement to uphold the people's mandate. Thank you. Okay, the last word goes to Professor Saunders.
Yeah, the last word, that's a big responsibility. Can I just say something about the reference to international norms in the question? At the end of the day, this process has got to be designed in a way that is accepted in Fiji and works in Fiji. At a general level, there are, of course, there's a lot of international practice around constitution making, much of which emphasizes participation. And there's now a huge body of learning on that. But one of the things that body of learning tells us is that participation needs to be more than a tick-a-box exercise. And to make it genuine, you need to think about the purpose of participation. And the purpose will vary depending on where participation occurs in a constitution-making process. If it occurs at the beginning, it'll be much more of an open participation process that's trying to get in ideas. If it occurs at the end, it'll be public participation designed to help people understand what's going on and to get, at best, feedback. So there's a lot of thought needs to go into structuring in participation and inclusion. On the question of legal and political safeguards, I was thinking as everyone was talking, in a sense, there are three phases in this constitutional amendment process. There's the first phase where the ideas for change are produced, and that may be from a commission. Someone referred earlier to a constituent assembly, but I think maybe a citizens' assembly might be more appropriate. It's an idea that a lot of people have been experimenting with in recent decades, that you get together broadly representative group of people from all parts of the country, either to come up with ideas for change or to against whom you can test ideas for change. So the idea of introducing a citizens' assembly at the early stage in this process is something that you might consider. The second stage in the process is laid down by the Constitution as interpreted by the Supreme Court. The parliamentary process, that's the process of initiating the formal changes to the Constitution. As previous speakers have noted, there's a special majority requirement. There'll need to be a lot of negotiation to hit that number. But once, if it is possible to develop the relevant majority in the Parliament, that should be a good foundation for the referendum. And then the third and last part of the process is the referendum itself. It's important, of course, that there be transparency for all of that, but it's also important that there be integrity. And the integrity of the referendum process in particular is something to which thought needs to be given. Is there an independent body that monitors the referendum process? I think I suggested that earlier. Or can it just be left to the Electoral Commission, but with special responsibilities in relation to a referendum, which is what happens in Australia? So it may be helpful to, in terms of legal and political protections, to think of the process as falling in those three groups, and then say, well, what do we need to protect each part of that process? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Saunders. We really appreciate your contribution this evening. Okay, so the last word goes to Ms. Dutui Turanga, as a panelist, that is.
I don't have a legal point to make, but one of the points I had, which I didn't mention, it hasn't come up, is the important role of the media. I think it's really critical that we encourage independent media coverage and analysis to keep the public informed and engaged, and I think that's really critical. Thank you.